Wow. That is probably one of the most incredible conversations I've had in my entire life. It's going to stay with me for the rest of my professional career, but probably much longer. My conversation was with author, scientist, Professor Ursula Goodenough. And I've put all the links to her work in the description below this video so you can find out that links to her website and also to her book and all sorts. Up until now, I've called myself an atheist. However, now I think I prefer the term non-theist, and we discussed that in detail in the conversation, and you can find out why I'm kind of veering towards that now. We also discussed some of the issues with words like religion versus religious, and why our moral framework should be grounded in the sanctity of nature itself. After all, if that's not worthy of our reverence, then what is? But don't be put off by the discussion of ethics, morality, and religion. This is something completely compatible with a scientific worldview. First and foremost, Professor Goodenough is a scientist. She does not have any belief in a god or the supernatural at all. None. But she does believe in the value of the human experience and the value of connection to each other and to the planet to build a better future for humanity as a whole. Without further ado, here is my conversation with Professor Ursula Goodenough. Hello, I'm Dr. Chris Earle, and I'm joined today by Dr. and Professor Ursula Goodenough. I just thought we would start right off the bat by finding out a little bit more about you. You've done so much throughout a really long and illustrious career, loads of academic awards, lots of research papers, lots of teaching. I think most of it was done at Washington University. The first thing that sticks out for me thinking about anything like that, so I worked in a research lab for a few years as well, but at the moment it's quite a tumultuous time, particularly in the USA. So I thought you would actually have quite a unique vantage point in terms of how you feel about that.
Well, I retired in 2017 and moved to Martha's Vineyard, and so I don't have a lab. I'm not involved. I'm not trying to write grants, but I certainly think that what's going on is awful, and hopefully when we get rid of the current president, things can revert to what they used to be.
The other thing that gives you a kind of important insight into all of this is because you've come from cellular biology and microbiology. And so when we think about not just academics and the pursuit of knowledge, because that is, of course, a really important thing in itself, but also things like infectious disease control and stuff like that, trying to narrow down the source of those things is going to be harder because funding's been taken away from places like the CDC and other organizations. So it's not just academic, even though you and I would probably agree that what is academic is actually very, very important in itself. But yeah, it has a knock-on effect to the whole of society. So Ursula, do you want to tell us about your actual research work that you did do with a lab over the years? Because I know you had a number of different interests.
Well, there weren't that many. I worked almost exclusively with the unicellular green alga called Chlamydomonas, or clammy, we called it. And the bulk of our questions related to its sexual cycle. How does it have two mating types? How is that regulated? What are the products of the mating type gene expression in terms of their behavior during the mating reaction? And then how does the resultant zygote differentiate into a diploid inert spore and then emerge doing meiosis? So lots of the work sort of figured a big bunch of that out. There were a few other labs doing it as well, notably Bill Snell in Texas, but it wasn't like we had 100 labs that we were competing with, so we could kind of do it in a methodical manner without a lot of rush. And then in 2010, something like that, I was kind of thinking that, well, we answered the major questions, and the whole idea of making biodiesel from algal lipids was beginning to emerge, and there was funding to study that. And so we switched over to that and made, I think, some important contributions to that. The problem was, and probably always will be, well, it certainly is now, that algae, and particularly Chlamydomonas, do very poorly in large outdoor ponds where you'd have to grow them to get enough algae to make a difference. And that problem is kind of meant that the DOE lost interest in the project, and so we didn't succeed in getting it funded after about 5 years. And by that time, I was ready to retire, and so I did.
And just to pick you up on that, I remember looking at this a few years ago, and in fact, it might have been around that time actually. I remember seeing these tubular vats that would be lit on in 360 degrees. You know, the sort of innovations people were trying to come up with, how you can continue to get light into the whole thing. It would have to be continually moved or something like that. Was that just something that then became, you were putting in as much energy as you could ever hope to get out? Was that the kind of problem?
That's the problem with the ones that worked. So what the hope was that it could be moved outdoors where you could use sunlight, and the outdoor ponds just kept getting contaminated and with bacteria, and the cultures would die. And I mean, people are still struggling with it. There's a lot of work on it, and Chlamydomonas turns out to have been a poor organism for that. There are lots of other ones that, for example, can live in salt water, which is a lot more available and less prone to contamination, and have more robust cell walls. So, I'm not saying it can never be a source of fuel. I'm just saying that, our particular approach, while we answered some of the questions in terms of what genes are involved and so on, it wasn't going to save the world.
And you said it was the lipids that would be converted to biodiesel. So all that photosynthesis that's being carried out, all that energy acquisition, is it the lipids that just then make up the cell membrane and make up the membranes within the cell?
So
what are these lipids?
The lipids that the algae make are triacylglycerides, which are different from the phospholipids that are in membranes, and they put them into storage vacuoles, little drops. Some people call them lipid droplets, that sit in the cytoplasm with a monolayer of membrane around them. And we could harvest them. We got a lot of it. Got them, so they made a lot of it. So it's all doable. It's just not ready for prime time yet.
One of the things I heard about innovation, and I think it's probably really true, is that the initial intended purpose of whatever thing someone's trying to develop, it very often ends up being used somewhere else. So it might not even be bio. And I'm sure there's already other thoughts about the value of these triacylglycerides. Is that what? In these lipids inside these little storage units. So yeah, they might be used for something else that will be of interest at a later date. And so when you wanted to harvest those, you would lyse the cells open, and then what would be the next step there to pull out the lipid containing?
The lipids float. The lipids float, so when you centrifuge, they stay up at the top, and so harvesting is easy.
That's great. I mean, so all you need to do is burst open the cells, and do you do that in quite a gentle way, and that with this?
It doesn't really matter, but in clamming, we know how to break them open. We figured that out a long time ago. In some of the algae, like Nanochloropsis, which has a very robust cell wall, that is turning out to be a big problem as to how to break them open.
You mentioned the something that was a bigger part of your research career, which was the sex determination in Chlamydomonas, and I just think that's a very interesting thing. I think in terms of thinking about the bigger picture of understanding life, what was interesting to me about that is you're talking about single-celled eukaryotic organisms, and the fact that they're able to undergo a sexual reproduction process to me, this seems like quite a landmark innovation in the history of life on Earth.
I mean, yeast certainly, of course, does it, and lots of fungi, and it's widespread among the algae. Some of them have given it up, but I think that probably the first eukaryotes were clearly had figured out meiosis, since meiosis goes throughout the eukaryotes. So if you go back, it had to have been in the original one. So during the early stages of eukaryogenesis, meiosis was figured out, and meiosis entails bringing two different kinds of organisms together, so you get mating types or sexes, and you, as a result, get to have independent assortment, and the progeny have different sets of chromosomes, and that's a good thing in terms of being adaptive.
For people who are maybe not familiar, things like bacteria, they can replicate by division, and they can just split sort of in two and create two new bacterial cells from one. But in this case, there is the additional option for these organisms, these eukaryotic organisms. And ultimately, the function of that then is like a sort of shuffling and a diverse generation of diversity. Is that seen as being the general reasoning behind that existing? Yeah.
Correct.
Cool. Yeah, and then we'll just do a whistle-top tour of your career. So then you got really into the molecular biology of it, the genes involved, and the molecular mechanisms behind the two different sex types in the Chlamydomonas, and actually made a lot of progress on that, and a lot of contributions there in terms of really got to the bottom of it. So from my investigations, it looks like in 1954 there was a paper where they kind of appreciated there were two different sex types of Chlamydomonas, but by the time that you finished working on it, you had the genes involved, you had the structures on the cell that were involved in the compatibility between the two different DNA types. So I mean, that must be a source of pride for you then as well, to have done that.
We had fun.
And you the other thing you said was you weren't feeling rushed. You were able to enjoy it. You were able to do it properly and the right way, which often isn't the case in academia. Nowadays especially, I don't know if that's changed. There's so much pressure to have outputs.
Yeah, there's pressure, and all the time that my lab was running, there were labs that had many more students and postdocs who were studying HIV and studying, really heavily funded and importantly and correctly funded disease organisms and so on. So we were kind of in the backwoods in terms of the questions that we were asking, but they were good questions and we answered them.
Yeah, to be honest, it's the kind of project I love, which is it's where you work on the organism. Well, this is how I see it, but you might see it differently. You work on the organisms for its own value, and you've got a puzzle, which is how does this biological phenomenon work? And then you just get to tinker away on it. You get to come up with creative ways of asking the question. And for me, that's just endlessly enjoyable. That's kind of like and this brings us more into the other realm of your life, which is how we think about our connection to science and the universe and each other and the world as a whole. Because to me, that's a wonderful way of doing science, which is a mastery thing. You just you do it, you could turn up each day focused on the thing in front of you, which is whichever part of the process you're looking at. You're not thinking about outcomes. You're thinking in a mastery sense, more mindfully about what you're doing. So much better for your well-being. But then when you start to think of outcomes like, oh, we'll need to find out the answer, it then takes away some of the joy for me. Do you find any link?
Well, you're doing both. You obviously want answers because you want to publish papers and get money. So that doesn't go away. I was just trying to make the point that we weren't under pressure to, hoard our reagents or be suspicious. And in fact, this other lab headed by Bill Snell, he gave us a lot of antibodies and reagents to do some of our most important work because he had lost interest in pursuing it. So that kind of thing doesn't often happen in very competitive fields.
And that's a great outcome, yeah. And that's a nice departure from what it can be like. And I guess that's the thing. We know what it can be like when people are ultra competitive and they're not really discussing their results and they're not sharing reagents and stuff like that, which is a huge inefficiency in the system as a whole when things are working like that. But when it's collaborative, like it was for you, I presume he also just said, he gave you the kind of like the rundown of where he got to with it as well, the stuff that was maybe not
Well, he had
published.
published several things on this topic and had used his reagents, but nobody in his lab was interested in pursuing it, and we were, so he sort of handed it off.
Yeah.
And we, of course, acknowledged all of that in our publications.
Okay, so I've got your book here. I don't know, did you see it in the background? Or was I covering?
I did.
You did see it, yeah. Did you like the setting that I had? I have to credit my
I liked
partner.
the periodic table coffee cup. Yeah, that was lovely.
You like the well, actually, I'll bring this in because I think this is a good way of putting it. So this is a periodic table mug, and inside is a plant. And I felt, well, this already existed on that shelf, but I thought it was a great thing to take a picture of the book beside, because the mug represents the science, the periodic table, but also the nature is the plant. And ultimately, that's kind of like I would say that's kind of like, if I could only say two things about the book, it would be science and nature. Now, if we go into more detail about this work, what we mean by nature becomes something very broad in terms of, well, you talk about even almost going as, you even use words a lot of people would be scared of using, but you fully qualify your choice of those words from my point of view, which is that nature can be a source of the kind of deep, meaningful, transcendental experiences that was normally reserved for religion. Now, something about this type of work is that acknowledgement of, which some people don't do in the sciencey space, the acknowledgement that there is utility and value from religious practices. Now, there's no debate about this in here. That value is just evident throughout, and you're just running with it. But I think what I was going to do was get you to tell me where that came from. Now, I already partly know after reading the book, but your father was a big influence in that respect. He was walking a line almost between those two worlds of science and religion already. It was something you kind of you were already exposed to.
Well, yeah, I can't say my dad was a scientist. He never, I don't think he could have explained the second law of thermodynamics to you. But he certainly admired it, and many of his children became scientists. So there was that. But he instead became a historian and was interested in the history of religions, ancient religions. And let me also say, responding to where you started, was that the fact that I find my spiritual life to be anchored in nature and in our science-based understandings of nature is hardly unique to me. I mean, we can go back to Spinoza, go back to some of the Greek philosophers and so on. So because scientific inquiry in the last century has given us so many new insights into how nature works at the molecular level, at the deep level, the sacred depths, I had the opportunity to describe the natural world in language and with understandings that weren't available to earlier philosophers, but it's certainly not a new idea.
But I think that what you just said there is so profound for me, because, and actually I'll even, I'm trying to not just read, but this book, which I've done, but it's not about just reading like most kind of spiritual practices. Again, a word that might bother some more than others, is it's about actually embodiment, and it's about actually living it, and it's actually about how it changes the way you move through the world. It's really more than that. But I think that, and the other thing I'll say is, you talked about the predecessors to this idea, which couldn't really be the same because they didn't know, like you said, they didn't know the depth of it. They didn't know the molecular level, which was that's what you'd worked on professionally. And when I saw the description of this book, I went, oh right, okay, so this already does exist. I've been looking for that. Because for me, a lot of the debate between science and religion, for better or for worse, and I think you probably just avoid it to allow you to actually focus on what's important. That's the sense I get, which is living a meaningful life and a connected life. But I do think if we indulge it for a moment, the science-religion debate, whether there is or is not a God, and then we often get into the weeds of the wording of Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species, and I'm just sitting there thinking, we've had 160 years of biology, where biology has become a professional endeavour, not just reserved for a small number of people who had the financial privilege to allow them to study it, not to belittle any of someone like Darwin's contributions. And then in the last 75 years, because of electron microscopy, because of X-ray crystallography, from the world of physics and chemistry, we access the molecular level for the first time. So this is all quite new, but it completely blows open our understanding of life. But the philosophers don't know any of that. The philosophers are kind of still stuck. Sorry, you'll know the ones that do. You know the ones that do. But
yeah,
the mainstream.
They were trained in other things, and a lot of the philosophers are still focused on the human, which has been the usual thing for philosophers, or subject for philosophers to comment on and help us understand. And a lot of philosophers are still doing that, and that's fine. So, but there are philosophers who realize that our understandings of nature are also something that they can consider using their skills and their training, and some of them are doing that.
But what you've done, and I think is the right approach, and I would stand by it, is if we're going to talk about what we are, what the universe is, how we sit within it, we start from the science. And this book is a science book, I would say, for probably is 80% science, it feels anyway. It's all about the science, but it's coming from that perspective of talking about the origin of life. We're talking about life at the molecular level, all the way up to human language and culture. And I think, for me, that is the story that we should be expanding on. We are expanding on. Again, even some of the sciences sometimes heavily focused towards, say, humans. Let's explain what humans are. For me, I think the greatest insights into what life is comes from microbiology. Seeing life in its purest form, the earliest cells, the transition from non-living chemistry on an early Earth to something we would start to describe as life. But this is an ambitious book, so you cover all that in here. You talk about the evolution of the universe in terms of starting out with just hydrogen and helium, the sort of light elements of the periodic table, stars forging heavier types of atoms, and then how that all relates to life in terms of life on Earth and how those things are all needed. So I just wanted, it's a contentious subject, and I think I just wanted to make it very clear to people that although we're talking here about religiosity and we're talking about those types of things, in terms of a science book, this is really, really good. I compared it to Bill Bryson's A Short History of Nearly Everything, which was a huge book that very, very well read. But I prefer this because it's focused on biology, it's focused on life, and it takes us down to that molecular level. I mean, that's exactly what I'm trying to do with my own stuff too. So, yeah, I found it absolutely fascinating. And it's written in such a clear way. It's written, and did you pitch it that way? How it's hard, isn't it, to know when you pitch information? Is this seen as something that, like, if someone's interested, they've not got a degree in science, was it kind of aimed that they would still be able to take all of the
Absolutely.
value? Yeah.
Yeah. So I had, lots of friends, girlfriends, etc. Had no idea about the second law of thermodynamics either, and not very interested. And I wanted to let them see this whole part of their existence, and so I tried very hard to write for them. And I mean, but as you've noted, I didn't. There's one way of doing that, which is just to be really vague and say, they're cells, and then quickly move to the human because you figure that's what your reader is really interested in. And I didn't do that. I stayed, as you know, with the molecules for a long time.
Yeah, and I think
And
that's the right thing to do for me. I think that's where the really interesting stuff is.
yeah, well, it's different strokes for different folks. And I mean, the book, has hardly been on the New York Times bestseller list, but what is cool is that I get emails on a regular basis from readers who did find it and, said something to the effect that it really changed their perspective on who they were and where we're going. So that's always, for an author, what you really hope to have happen.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, like, we all know ourselves, like, something that's a New York Times bestseller, it's going to sell millions of copies. It's the sort of thing that people buy with an intention to read it one day because other people have read it. If someone's coming to you saying, this had an effect on me, that's actually the reason you wrote the book anyway. I mean, that's the thing that matters, isn't it? But actually, on that note, the book was originally, I'm going to say, started in 1997 and came out officially in 2000, but this is actually a fully up-to-date version from 2023.
Right.
And it's got additional epilogues and a sort of foreword. I think one of those is new as well. So yeah,
I revised it throughout. I mean, if there was something that I wrote in the 90s that still worked, I left it. I might change a comma or something, but I knew what worked. I knew, particularly in the reflections, which are the parts that are the more spiritual parts of each chapter. I would get pastors emailing me saying that they had given a sermon on that reflection, and here's their sermon, and what did I think? And so I kind of knew which parts were really speaking to people, and I left those alone. But the in 25 years, a lot has happened, particularly in our understandings of evolutionary dynamics and how the brain works and stuff. And so it's probably half new.
And the way that, because I think publishers all have different standards, but what is clear from me, and you can again tell me if I'm wrong, is the scholarship here in terms of the references, even some of the extra information you've given on the endnotes in terms of why a thing was used and what its purpose was as a reference and what it actually covers in the book. Like, you've put in the extra scholarship that you don't necessarily get asked to do.
That's how I was trained.
And no, but I think that's really, you see the care and attention and the love for the book that you have.
Thank you.
And I love that it didn't matter whatever Oxford University Press, who is obviously a very prestigious of the academic publishers, has published some of the biggest books in science, popular science as well. Obviously they have great standards, but I love that you just went, no, it doesn't matter what is required here. I want to have the epilogue. I want to include this extra piece of information. So I think what we should do now is get to the heart of it, because for me, the people who've been listening to these conversations, reading some of the articles I've written and stuff, I've made sure I want it to be a welcoming space. There's no It's not for atheists, or it's not for religious people. It's for all of those people. I see it myself. If someone's deeply religious, a Christian, but I can talk to them about the nature of biological life and enhance their understanding and maybe dispel some myths, then great, that's my job done there. You use the term non-theist rather than atheist, and I'm going to have to really consider whether I need to do the same. Can you tell me why that decision's important, or why it's a non-theist term that you prefer?
Okay, well, atheist has come to mean someone who actively believes that there isn't a supernatural realm, that there isn't a God. So it's a position, and it also has come in our culture, at least in Western cultures, to have a negative tone. So it has. We were told, as I was told growing up, the atheist communists in Russia, and they were awful, and so it was a noun that immediately put a lot of people on edge because of its cultural connotations. And so there was another word around called non-theist, which is used certainly by religious scholars to refer to traditions like Confucianism, Hinduism, not Hinduism, they have gods, but Buddhism, and so on, where a supernatural realm is not included. Now, Buddhism has its own version of a supernatural realm, the consciousness and so on. So, but there's certainly no guy in the sky with a beard kind of God. And when I use the term, what it means to me is not only that I don't use God language or have a belief in a supernatural God, but I think of myself as a religious person, but I'm not interested in the God question. It's not. There's so much else for my religious life to focus on. And when I find myself in a room or in a conference where people are debating whether it's a God or not, and what language you should use, and what blah blah blah, I get bored. It's just not. It gets in the way of where I'm trying to develop my spiritual life. So I don't know whether everybody else who uses the term non-theist is also put off or uninterested in the question of theism, but that describes me and at least some of my friends.
Yeah.
So it works for me, and the minute if somebody says, "What's your religion?" and I say I'm a non-theistic religious naturalist, that obviously has 3 nouns in there, 2 nouns and an adjective that are that generate discussion and conversation.
So this term, religious naturalism, and again, we've got some words there. There's some connotations. People are going to be put off by the term religious. I think I was convinced that spirituality was a valuable term for me as a person who didn't have supernatural beliefs a long time ago. I also started to feel that transcendence, again, it can mean a lot of different things. I still want transcendental experiences. So as a sort of like, you've got to remember, like, you talk about the negative connotations of atheism and stuff like that to do with communism and things. I was quite a young person when, Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, Daniel Dennett were doing their speaking tours and doing their debates. And so this was quite an exciting time for me and I know a lot of people connected with it because maybe they'd been through school and they'd always had to sing religious songs and stuff like that. And it felt like a bit affirming to certain people that there were people coming out being really rude and really kind of hostile, but under the guise of the truth is the truth and it doesn't matter how it makes you feel. And so there was kind of like a liberating thing there, but it was also becomes quite negative. And I think that we're still in that place, actually, especially on online spaces, like people can't see beyond that. So it took me a long time to then go, right, maybe I can think about something like spirituality or transcendence in a positive way. And you have to refuse to take things, the words and the connotations of the words superficially. You have to refuse all that and go, right, what could it mean for me? And I think that's what you've done there with this term religious naturalism, is you've moved towards something that means something to you. And is that the case for all religious naturalists, that it's what it means to them? Do you have Christian and all faiths represented, or is it an atheist thing? Or
okay, so first of all, I've tried very hard, although I myself am guilty of abusing it. I've tried very hard to avoid naturalism. That suggests that there's a canon, that there's a way of being a religious naturalist that is encoded and dogmatic and so on. So I, throughout my time in trying to promote this, I've always start out by saying, no, we're not talking about naturalism. We're talking about being a religious naturalist. And a naturalist has a very different connotation. We kind of think of somebody out bird watching with binoculars or something. It's friendly and nice and peaceful, and much more what I'm trying to talk about, because a naturalist takes the natural world seriously, including all of its depths and its molecules and its evolution. Those understandings, that story, which we're calling everybody's story, is part of their canon. So a naturalist is that. And then a religious naturalist takes that story, and all religions have core myths, takes the story of the universe and develops spiritual and moral responses to it. And so spiritual, sure, some people get uptight about the word spiritual, but it means breath, it means essence, it means just, it has come to have connotations of ghosts and supernatural entities, but that's an adoption. That's not what the word really means. And then moral ethical is, I would argue, what religious practices and things have always been about. They've always been about trying to educate people's social emotions, trying to keep people from killing each other and being nice to each other, and so on. So there have been thousands of different religious traditions over the history of humans, and they all, in the end, can be understood deeply as giving guidance for how to be good and how to find meaning in life. So I don't have any problem with the word religious. Again, religion is different from religious, because we're back to sort of an ism of something with buildings and clergy and tithing and promises of often of everlasting life, etc. And so we definitely don't use the term religion. We talk about religious, which is a much more giving word.
Yeah.
And then we've already done non-theistic, so I guess we're there.
Yeah, but the other word, I think, and this is, I've been kind of enjoying this recently for myself, is the words that we use are really important, particularly in science. And I like how you're thinking that way. If you call it an ism, naturalism, then the idea then is it becomes more like that rigid framework that dogma, doctrine, inflexible, maybe a bit more rigid, potentially. So I guess in a sense you could leave it kind of without the rigid framework and give, or you could write a framework that's extremely flexible and all-encompassing. Do you have something like that as well, maybe, where it's...
Well, I'd say my book is one.
Yeah.
And other books that religious naturalists have written and are writing, and articles and so on. We're all exploring it from looking for things that particularly speak to us. And one of the frames that everybody uses is whatever they were brought up with. If you're brought up in a in a Southern Baptist environment, that's where you start, and you can attempt to say, I don't believe in any of it, it's all bullshit, I'm starting over. But the brain doesn't work that way. The brain the brain remembers your childhood understandings. And so a lot of the religious naturalist writings and speakings and ceremonies are, derive from things that places from which we came. And a Buddhist version of this is going to be different from a Hindu version. It's going to be different from a strictly, four horseman atheist version. So, Richard Dawkins read my book and he said, if what she's saying is true, then I'm a religious man, and I'm not. And I said back in my head, I never said it to him, yes, you are really.
Yeah, he is.
And
Yeah,
in
I
fact,
think he is.
there's an interesting Dawkins story. He was once asked by an interviewer, okay, you're marooned on a desert island. What 5 things do you want to have with you? And one of his 5 things was a recording of Bach's B minor Mass. So, he doesn't agree with any of the words, but the art is glorious, and the meaning and the experience of listening to it is glorious. And that's what he wanted to do on his desert island.
Yeah, and that would be a transcendental. Well, that's what I mean, it'd be for him to say, but because it's a personal experience. But I think that type of music where it's a one song you could ever listen to again for the rest of your life, and you choose it. I mean, I think, and especially like with that type of music, it paints pictures, it creates emotional experiences, And I guess that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about...
But Bach was a believer. He was a Christian, and those words, I'm sure, were deeply meaningful to him. And I suppose that one could take the Bach B minor Mass and put in new words about birds and blue skies, but it wouldn't have the same meaning. I mean, we have to acknowledge where our artists are coming from, what their frame is, in order to understand their output.
Yeah, I think as well with Richard Dawkins is, I think he went to private school, and I think in England, I believe, and there's quite a rigid sort of Christian thing there. Whereas for me, I went to an ordinary school here, and nobody took the religion seriously. Like, nobody was religious. A couple of the teachers were sometimes. None of the pupils were. So we did sing the hymns. I liked singing. I love singing. So I did actually quite like singing the hymns. Some of the songs are really good, But there wasn't a huge amount of thing for me to feel I needed to have a backlash against it, really. Other than just like the kind of intellectual and academic exploration. But I think that's probably quite unusual. I think, friends I've spoken to, I've got quite a bad experience with Catholic teachings in school, doing things they didn't want to do. And also like the way some of the dogma or doctrine, and people can argue whether it's a genuine part of the religion or the teachings versus a cultural thing, and someone else can argue about that. But there's aspects of it that...
all religions are cultural, right? So let's start
Yeah.
there.
It's going to
and
have
they're
that
all
to it, yeah.
yeah, and human culture is created by humans, but it's part of nature. Religions are part of nature, so you can't say they're unnatural. They, to the extent that they envisage a supernatural part of how things work, at that point they are no longer naturalists, because so far our naturalist understandings don't include by definition something that's supernatural. If we discover something that we didn't know about before in scientific inquiry, that thing that we discover fits in with all the other things we've discovered about nature when we plop it in. And some people have argued that what some of the people who are trying to rescue the ancient traditions are fighting is sort of a God of the gaps. That God used to have done everything, but as we understand nature better and better, we say, well, we don't really need God for that. We can have mutation and natural selection instead of creating all of the animals on the ark. And so God has become less and less involved, at least in the creation of the natural world. And so where God remains important to a lot of believers is, I would say, the promise of an afterlife. And that's the biggie. And it's a biggie in Buddhism as well. We don't like death very much. And if we're given the way to avoid that, many people buy into it.
Yeah. So for me personally, that's probably where, with Buddhism, I had to pick and choose very carefully, because I saw some very hyper-rational interpretations of Buddhism that I liked, but then some ideas, and I guess Buddhism's incredibly diverse, really diverse in terms of different practices.
Absolutely.
I couldn't even begin to understand. And then you've got issues with translation, words that aren't effectively translated into English and all that. And then ultimately it's supposed to be about experience of meditation, the actual practice. But so much of the Buddhist stuff does, for me, get a little bit too mystical. A lot of it is quite mystical, more so than maybe, again, it depends on the type. So I was drawn to Zen Buddhism, which tends to strip away most of that.
Right.
But still, for me, yeah, like concepts of karma and supernatural realms and stuff that can kind of, I don't. So anyway, when I practiced a bit of Buddhism, I also didn't really connect with the chanting. It might have been that I didn't understand the purpose of it or what it meant, or maybe there isn't one, I don't know. But I can see how chanting could assist you towards a mindful state, because there's some sort of focus of attention. So I can see that. I can see the value of that.
Chanting, of course, is in all religions. I think the Jews chant, the Native Americans chant, the pagans chant. We all chant. We all like rhythmic music to quiet our mind, allow mindfulness to enter, and it's a good. And I mean, even the B minor mass, even though it has melodies and you wouldn't say it's chanting, it's a form of music that helps us access our spiritual side.
I like that a lot. I feel like, so, because as a religious naturalist, you talk about sermons, you talk about, I guess, events and stuff. So is that the kind of thing that you would, again, I guess there's the flexibility, but are those the kind of events that are run where people are meditating together, or what sort of stuff happens?
People ask me that a lot, and my answer, until I get a better one, is that if you're a religious naturalist, you know it. It's in your bones. That's how you think of the world. In terms of ritual, ceremony, music, art, um, a lot of the stuff that was created in the context of traditional religions still speaks to you. You know, you don't have to agree with the words of a chant to love the chant. I mean, I'll listen to a Gregorian chant. It's in Latin. I have no idea what they're saying. I'm sure it's something about God, but that's irrelevant to me. So we've had, you know, millennia and millennia of wonderful people developing these services, these rituals, these stories, and they're all there to be accessed by the religious naturalist without any apology. And I think that's where it's sort of sad about, you know, the folks like Dawkins and Dennett, is that they say, the whole stuff, it's all rubbish. I'm not going to have anything to do with any of it. And I think they miss out. And in fact,
Yeah,
Dawkins knows that if he wants Bhakti to be with him on his island.
yeah. And I think he talks about being a cultural Christian. You know, he's not trying to hide away from
I
it.
mean, the story I heard about Richard is that his daughter he was divorced and his daughter was going to a very religious Church of England school, and he read the kind of stuff that she was being told, and he was furious. And I guess his ex-wife was into it as well. And so a lot of it, as is true for a lot of us as we explore our religious lives, was kind of personal. You know, it was kind of had to do with, in the case of Catholics, those awful nuns who slap their wrists with rulers and stuff. So, you know, we can't be pure in our searches. We have to bring what we know and have experienced.
If we say that was 30, 40, 50 years ago that happened in his life, I'm sure even a religious naturalist exposed to the same information would go, no, come on, you're teaching young people here, teach them the actual science, like maybe have, you know, like sometimes those things aren't separated appropriately, because ultimately, and this is a thing Richard Dawkins says, and I think it's true to some extent, which is that a universe with a God is in some way a different proposition from one without, metaphysically, and I guess so. But obviously, I don't want it. That forces us back to the whole debating the existence of God or not, which feels, like you say, counterproductive, gets in the way of things and isn't helpful. So one of the other things, again, talking about words religious naturalist, is you describe it as an orientation. So again, you're trying to avoid creating a rigid code or dogma that has, and you talk about how it's constantly revised with new information, just as your book has been. You know, just as your book is 26 years later, is different, and that's not a problem. Whereas religion tends to try and cling on maybe to something after it's kind of outdated.
Find a new interpretation rather than just chucking it.
Yeah. One of the things I'm trying to do is, because you're obviously well versed in it, me, I'm not practiced so much in it, which is to see the value in ethics. Like, we're talking about ethics then, because one of the things that's hard without God is creating an ethics around that. You know, you can become a sort of nihilist when it comes to ethics, where you say there's no good or bad, or at least there's no objective morality. And for me, religion on this, you know, I think one of the best things I've heard from any religion ever that I really like is and I'll not recapitulate this well, but Jesus talking about let he who is without sin cast the first stone. That's one of my favourite ones. You know, I believe the scenario is a woman that's about to be stoned to death for adultery by no doubt much more sinful people than she is.
She did
Um,
it with somebody.
oh yeah, exactly. That's a good point. But don't you? So sometimes people have kind of said, well, actually, right? If we're talking, if we're expansive and we can include anything, Jesus was kind of like this. Maybe I'm wrong, but he's sometimes seen as this left-wing, progressive, ethical, compassionate guy, and so there's a lot to be taken from
Absolutely.
that.
No, I think Jesus was wonderful. Buddha was wonderful. He had said great things. Tao Chi was wonderful. Confucius. I mean, a lot of these guys were super and wrote down great stuff and as you know, in my book, I quote them
Yeah,
on many occasions without any shame or feeling ambiguous about it, because they're just other people who were trying to figure out the same things that I'm trying to figure out. And I can also, you know, glean a lot from science because we're a social species, and some species are social and some aren't. We are, and we can look not only at non-human primates, but at dolphins, at bumblebees. I mean, there's all sorts of social species who have figured out how to live in community without harming or killing each other, and instead flourishing in that community. And those are the rules that are followed, are moral rules, ethical rules, as far as I'm concerned. They will differ depending on the organism, because each organism or each of these social species is living in its own context, with its own predators, with its own resources, and so on. So what might be a good idea to do if you're a predator, which is to kill prey, uh, is not something that humans think is a good idea, unless, of course, it's the enemy, where we think that it's okay. But these moral rules are not built in, not etched in stone in nature, but the need for them is paramount in any species that's trying to live cooperatively. And so nihilism, I mean, so to me, nihilism, as articulated by the gloomy philosophers and the existentialists and so on, that's saying, yeah, that's all very well, but that's proximate and that's not ultimate. And ultimately, the universe doesn't have any meaning. And I agree with that. I mean, I don't see that there's any, unless one is a theist and says that God created the Big Bang for a reason and the whole thing has a reason in terms of what God says, in which case then you have to go have God making up rules and articulating them and burning bushes. But if you don't need to go there, then the fact that we need to figure out how to be nice to each other and be nice to the planet is a no-brainer. Of course we do.
and the term that you use in the book to encompass that is eco-morality. And it
Yes,
seemed,
exactly.
yeah, and that probably would be capturing some of the things that you're saying there. But I think the other thing that your perspective allows, your broad perspective allows, is to say that, well, social behaviour, antisocial behaviour, all of those dynamics are natural in themselves. They've evolved over time, developed over time, as has religion too. Now, the problem that people come to is they
Well,
then say,
they're usually articulated in religions,
oh yeah,
although we then sort of beef them up with laws and punishments and rewards and stuff like that. But usually a law, take the Constitution, etc., is grounded in some sort of more meta uber concept of what it is to be a good person and a good member of the society. And religion says if you're good, then you go to heaven. And so that's sort of an added bonus. But the ways to be good turn out to map completely onto ways that allow a culture to flourish.
Yeah, and it's played a role in terms of societal improvement and progress, and
Absolutely.
because people
I mean,
when
even,
they
you
take,
know, you can say that, well, I don't like Deuteronomy or wherever it is that says you're not supposed to be homosexual. So, you know, it's not like these religions don't have understandings of what it is to be a good person, that they don't get it right every time. Okay. And we can do the same thing with Muslim understandings, etc. We can do it with any understandings. We're not going to agree with them all. But when you're a religious naturalist, you have the wonderful freedom to pick and choose.
yes, and
You can shop around. You can say, "Oh yeah, I love the meditative traditions. I love to meditate. Meditating is good, and it helps me to find my spiritual depths." And but I don't have to call myself a Buddhist. I don't have to agree that when I die, I'm going to come back as something else. I mean, you know, I don't have to go for all of the things that are in the traditions, but there are wonderful things there,
but you can
including
respect the
most of
natural.
what Jesus said.
Yeah, it was good stuff. Yeah, and
Jesus was a really cool dude.
yeah, and the as a religious naturalist, to completely understand the natural history of religion as a thing that emerges from biological life and feeds back into, can sometimes take us to a higher level of morality that maybe wouldn't have been possible without language, culture, written
Oh yeah.
words, all of those things. And yeah, I think the problem is when you're polarized, as we said right at the start, if you're debating the God question, look at what you've missed there. What an opportunity that's been missed in terms of taking the value from something, but also, yeah, fully recognizing the natural, that everything's natural essentially, and the organic
Including
nature of
death.
religion. Yeah, well,
Including death.
that's probably the biggest problem, isn't it?
Yeah. So, I mean, you know, when I was at a conference once and there was a Methodist minister there who was loving what we were doing. And she said, I wonder what would happen if I got up next Sunday morning and told them that, you know, it's not true. When you die, you become compost and that's it for your life. And she sort of stared and she said, probably nobody would come back the next Sunday.
Yeah,
And that really struck me that, you know, for many people, even if they don't say it, it's Pascal's wager, you know, why not do it because it might be true and no harm lost to sit in some pews for us for an hour on Sunday. So, um, you know, we have a lot of work. Well, I mean, death is something to get used to it and to feel okay about it, is a lot of work.
I think death meditation in a number of different practices is something that can be the most insightful and cutting confrontation that a human can ever have, the most clarifying thing that can ever happen to a person in terms of what do they want their life to look like thereafter. And I know that there's a bit of that in a whole load of different traditions. The one other broad category of traditions we should absolutely not forget would be like indigenous knowledge, because there's so many ideas there that are religious naturalist, because there's a genuine connection with the natural world that we've kind of created barriers between us, concrete barriers, buildings that shield us even from the rest of our community. There's an individualism that's kind of rife in the modern world too, in the Western world. So Indigenous
So
cultures are important.
indigenous cultures are wonderful in terms of connecting with the earth, in terms of feeling part of the earth, other animals and everything. But, you know, let's be fair to them. They also have a whole thing going about ancestors, and ancestors come back and ancestors do bad things. I mean, they have many theistic qualities, uh, and they're part of their tradition too. And so we can say, I'm going to, as a religious naturalist, we can say I'm going to completely be in sync and in tune with indigenous understandings of the natural world, but I'm not into the ancestor part.
Yeah,
You know, because we don't have to be.
yeah,
Just like we don't have to be into reincarnation. Um,
yeah.
and lucky us.
Actually, I would go one step further as well. Sorry, just Richard Dawkins isn't just religious, but he's a religious naturalist. Sorry, as well. We should have maybe said that. You know, because his
Richard is a
whole,
religious naturalist.
yeah, because I mean, the whole thing's about the
Well,
beauty of the
I think
natural world.
yeah, but I think he'd have a hard time using the R word. So that's the problem. I mean, I haven't talked
Yeah.
to him recently. I've had two interactions, one a lunch and one a dinner with Richard Dawkins, and we were mostly talking about other things, and it was very pleasant. He's a lovely man. So
Yeah,
so I don't know where he is. I mean, he's my age, I guess. So he's thinking about end times.
New Zealand at the moment, I believe.
Okay, yeah, no, he's
I think he's
got a
saying
lot.
that's definitely his last tour.
His project is to point out the things about traditional religions that don't work if you're a naturalist. And I
Yeah,
just listed a couple, like reincarnation and ancestors that, you know, burn down your houses, burn down your teepees. So, I mean, his project is to point out that those don't make any sense and that he doesn't like them, and that people should stop organizing their lives around these ideas. Fine, go for it. It's a completely different project from what I'm trying to do,
what you're doing is
which is to
similar,
find.
but it's positive. There's a
No,
positive.
I'm trying to suggest that there's something better.
Yeah,
It's not
it's more
that
positive and
that's
more.
bad. That
Yeah,
it's not to put that down, but to say, okay, there are those ideas, but what do you think of this?
it's a more positive emphasis on the whole thing. I
Yeah,
think
yeah.
it's finding the value in it.
It's right. It's creative, and including, what do you think about the Sermon on the Mount? Great stuff. You know, you can leave out the God and the Father parts of it. Just listen to what Jesus was saying about who we are.
Well, I've had those conversations with Christian friends, and I've always thought, right, what can I take from this? And I always do that when I'm reading as well. Like, I don't mind reading someone I completely disagree with. And sometimes only, you know, I'll be honest. The book that I read that I took the least from, although I still took something, was Jordan Peterson's book, 8 Rules for Life or something. Now, I'm not saying I wouldn't take other things from him, because he talks a lot about narratives. You know, there'd be a lot in there. You used it earlier, myth. And again, for you, that means something very specific in terms of the fact that humans have these meaning stories, these narratives that gives context and connection to their lives. And it not in a derogatory way that someone might call something a myth to discredit it. You're using it an entirely different way again. The other term that I really like that you used is planetary matrix, because I think when we talk about religious naturalist orientation, we've got the sort of scientific worldview, what is the real thing. But then there's also, and you deliberately didn't use a term like Gaia, so I wonder if there's a significance there. But it also emphasizes that this is a living, breathing planet that's mutually interdependent on each other, and that gives we're the only creatures aware of this. So there's an immense responsibility then to the planet in the planetary matrix. So planetary matrix, is that a term that means not just the Earth, but the life and the biology and everything? How do you see those
Yeah,
terms?
so I coined it. I mean, some people talk about the, different parts. There's the biome and there's the, I can't remember what they call them, but what I tried to do with the matrix idea, and I'm so glad you like it because I'm very fond of it myself and thought of it, is the idea that when the Earth formed, it created rocks and atmosphere and core and all of the other things that we now that life then moved into and took from or utilized. It's a less confrontational thing, to create their own bodies and their own species and their own ecosystems, and that the whole thing is not something that you can separate into life and non-life. You just have it be the whole thing as a matrix. Now, that being said, I do have a piece, and we don't have to go here if you don't want to, but the whole animism piece, which sometimes to my ear is present in Gaian kind of language, where rocks are singing and mountains are weeping and that kind of thing. And I just go ahead and say that I understand that those work as metaphors, and they, a mountain would be weeping because it had just had its top cut off. So that's a perfectly excellent metaphor. But I really try to encourage people to think about when something is alive, it, has metabolism, it has genetics, it reproduces, there are things, it's a self, as I talk about. And to impose that same set of parameters on a rock is, to my mind, to disrespect the rock. It's trying to make the rock important because it's like me. And I respect the rock for its geologic essence, for all the experiences it's had deep in the earth, and all of that. It doesn't, though, have aims the way living creatures have aims. And why should we expect it to? Why should we value it if we say it has an aim, and not value it unless we animate it? So
See ourselves in it, yeah.
so
Then we can.
I mean, so a lot of people who think in Gaian terms understand that a lot of the Gaian language is metaphorical, and but I prefer to be in a situation where I'm not apologizing for, or and if you're a religious naturalist, that's kind of a vanilla perspective. And if you want to go ahead and say that the rocks are speaking to you, then, that isn't a naturalist position.
But someone could believe that and be a religious naturalist and practice religious naturalism the rest of the time.
They certainly could. And that
Yeah.
I have friends who go out and come back and tell me what the rocks said to them, and not as a metaphorical thing, but they really say they heard words, they heard language. So one possibility is that I'm defective,
Mhm.
that I can't do what their minds can do, and I'm hopeless. The other is that they are projecting it,
Yeah, that's
and
interesting.
and I don't. The last thing, I mean, it's sort of like arguments about God. I mean, I'm not really interested. If they've had that experience and it's meaningful to them, go for it. And my defective mind may never be able to hear a rock talking.
It's something that
But
I feel increasingly as well, that there's something that can happen in science where, because of the frustration of humans projecting their nature onto the world around us, and then the debates that happen whether there is or is not something supernatural to the universe, it gets very polarized. And then it becomes almost seen as a negative thing. And then that can lead you to a place where you stop respecting humans' experience. Now, we all live this short life, however we choose to live it, whatever is meaningful to us. I now have a deep respect for that in others, what it gives them, what it is for them. I want to hear from their point of view what the experience with the rock was. I don't need to come in and start putting myself into that conversation, you
right,
know? I think we struggle with
right.
that, don't we, as people?
We do. And at the same time, you know, what if at the same time, the whole notion that is embedded in the Gaian perspective, that everything is alive and that everything is singing, is, um, I don't know, it just doesn't work for me.
It doesn't work for me
And
either. I'm more,
yeah,
yeah,
but you know, it sure beats the bleep out of, you know, out of lots of um uh, you know, Christian nationalist perspectives. So go for it.
one thing I did want to ask you
Sure.
is Rachel Carson is another person whose ideas have come into your eco-morality aspects, thinking about the planet, thinking
So
about our relationship with nature. So obviously you can pull from anything. There's nothing that's not allowed. But I mean, this was it the book Silent Spring? I haven't actually read it, but I know that this is part of the sort of the environmental movement of the 60s, which had a very particular feel about it. And there was a lot of stuff actually, wasn't there, about reconnection with nature and
oh
oh,
yeah, no,
actually,
she was a religious naturalist for sure. I
yeah,
mean, we didn't have the word, but yeah, I have a long quote from her in the book, as you might remember. Um, and yeah, there are a lot of Carl Sagan is another. I mean, there are lots of scientists who I on our website for we haven't talked about it yet, but our Religious Naturalist Association is on the website. We have something called Religious Naturalist Voices, and I've lifted up, I don't know, several dozen people that, even though they didn't call themselves religious naturalists, I go ahead and say that they have that lean to them, and then lift up some of their poetry or their prose. So, I mean, I think Pope Francis was a religious naturalist. I think
oh yeah, you
Mikhail
quoted Pope
Gorbachev,
Francis. If
Gorbachev was a religious naturalist. I mean, you know, so there are lots of people who come to this even without uh, calling it. So I used to give sermons that I called "Are You a Religious Naturalist?" without knowing it, and
Mhm.
then tried to help people explore that idea.
I suppose one of the things, the other big thing for me is where it differs from humanism. Are you also a humanist, or is that a
Yeah.
separate thing?
Okay. So that comes up a lot. The humanists. Um, I mean, Richard, all of the four horsemen call themselves humanists. Well, I guess one of them calls himself a Buddhist, the Buddhist guy. Um, first of all, the word is hopeless. I mean, it suggests that the humans are what are important, and being a human is the big deal, which has absolutely nothing to do with the eco-morality that we're trying to talk about. And secondly, although humanism has a long history, and like any movement has things that you can agree with and object to, it has in much of its history been very stridently atheist, and putting down of other religions, and political in trying to keep Ten Commandments out of the schools and all of that kind of stuff, which it's fine. I'm a member of the AHA, and I support a lot of the work that they're doing. But it sort of, it doesn't feel religious. It doesn't, and they know that. And I've had several Zoom conversations with the leadership in humanist in AHA, trying to help them sort of be able to use words like spirituality without offending half of their membership. And
Yeah,
they, but anyway, the major commonality is that humanists reject a supernatural frame, and I would say I don't have any use for a supernatural frame. I'm not interested in going around rejecting it or
yeah.
pointing my finger at it. But in other ways, their agendas are really quite different. They're really, they say that they believe in the scientific worldview, and it grounds their thinking, but they rarely talk about it.
I've found
It's rarely.
sometimes some humanist writings and stuff, because they're kind of a victim of their time. They've, with staunch atheism being prominent maybe 20 years ago or something, they start to talk about life in the mechanical terms that became popular with Richard Dawkins' work, but it goes right back to Descartes. So again, I think that's the problem that can happen, where you in an attempt to be hyper rational, you strip life of all the qualities that it has in order for it to be less.
And you don't have to. I mean,
No,
there's totally unequivocal scientific basis for saying that all organisms are selves, all organisms have aims. You don't have to say that that's getting spooky.
but the track that they've gone down has meant they're in a like the hyper rational atheist type. They're in a position where they have to kind of reject agency and stuff. I mean, why?
I know, it's too bad.
It is, but they've created all, and then people get attacked online
They
if they
paint
use the
themselves
term.
into a corner with that stuff, and it's not necessary. But this kind of thinking, well, I'll summarize it as Terry Deacon kind of thinking, and emergence, and all of the stuff that those of us who think along those lines agree is got to be what's going on, and is very fertile for religious spiritual reflection. It's there. You just got to find it.
Yeah, and that's another thing about your book here, is that and by the way, all of the links will go into the description below the video, but I'm also going to record a little intro video, and I'll put the links at a prominent place at the start.
Okay, fine.
Because obviously if you put them at an hour in, that's not a good idea.
No.
So they'll go at the start and they'll go at the end, they'll go in the middle.
People have already started making lunch, I think.
I did a short video yesterday to just tell people that you were coming on and talk about the book in, within 2 minutes. It was very short. But one person did already go out and buy the book off of that. They said that's
good.
So that's really good, and hopefully more people will too. And this isn't an advertisement. I bought the book off my own money. The way YouTube works is it's quite weird. Like if I hadn't done so, for example, say you had sent me this book, then I have to post this as an advert and it would get 0 views. And it's not an advert, I value this book from my own experience of reading it. This isn't something that I was involved in any way at all,
Do you agree that it's beautifully produced? I mean, the paper and the colors and everything are, to my mind,
I think it's
wonderful.
I think it's really, I really like it. I also I really like the first edition too. I like the perspective, that the way it's done. Were you involved in the photography in any way?
Oh, so the covers of both books are, of course, turtles from Galapagos, and they both come from the same photographer, and not me. It's a woman named Tui Duroy who photographs the Galapagos.
Yeah,
but in the first edition, I just had some little black and white sketches. So this time they gave me color for
Oh,
all of the
okay.
figures. Yeah, and that was so none of the photographs are mine. I've got them. A lot of them were done by a woman named Maria who lives on Martha's Vineyard with me, and I used hers because I like
That's
to
nice.
support
Yeah.
friends.
Yeah, I think that's the greatest way. That's the best way to do it. Yeah, it is a beautiful book, a really beautiful book. And I guess that if we're talking about religiosity and stuff, books have always been important for conveying religious ideas. So, I mean, this must be
Absolutely.
incredibly precious to you as well. Like, it's all your ideas, but also the way it's presented and it looks beautiful. And the fact that, you're trying to capture that naturalistic tendency just with the photo, the beauty of it, the meaningfulness of it. For me, the other individual as well, you start to see other living creatures not just as animals of which we have dominion over them, but that may
And
have selfhoods in some
which we
sense as well.
are. We are
Is
animals.
there is there is there a strong sense of, again, I'm getting the feeling that it's such a welcoming environment, the Religious Naturalist Association, but is there a lot of people within that organisation that are vegetarian, vegan, maybe activists in some way as well,
Oh,
like
sure.
about fossil fuels and stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we don't sponsor anything like that, in part because we're just a volunteer group of people and don't have the time or the resources to do that. But we figure that anybody who's heard about what we're talking about and agrees to be a member is almost certainly also, questioning whether what kind of food they eat, is also volunteering locally to clean up the river or, monitor the birds. So we assume that that kind of activism is going to be already baked into somebody who wants to join us, and that what we've done is given them the resources to consider that behavior, if you will, not only something that they're proud of and believe in, but that it is in fact a religious practice.
Yeah, because then you're going to, and that would, I can imagine, when you start to engage mindfully with your environment, with the trees, with the plant species that are there, that sounds like indigenous knowledge again, and but it's also space in nature, which we know is great for how we feel, and yeah, so that's the practice then, and that could also be done in a way that's will be done in a way that's environmentally supportive as well. If there is a problem, if things need cleaned up, stuff like that.
Absolutely. And not to mention, human social justice. And I mean, there's lots of things within human culture, which, as we've previously agreed, is part of nature, but things that we are actively involved in disobeying and many of us are involved in trying to correct, so that there is social justice and poverty and prejudice and, I mean, da 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 da.
Yeah,
So
all of it.
it's not like a religious naturalist isn't concerned about human existence and flourishing. It's just that we see it as all being in the context of the natural world and how we evolved and what we bring to the table.
I mean, what's not to like? I mean, it just seems like those things are all evidently true, they're all true,
You just had
but there is
an
a,
altar call.
yeah, but then I suppose as well, like I totally respect that refusal to get into the trappings of traditional religious beliefs, which can become rigid and stuff. But at the same time, you probably want to have enough cohesion that it feels like it's making a difference, in terms of, like you're saying, like there's flexibility, It's going to be revised, but let there be no doubt about it. This is important,
Well,
this part.
look for the good stuff in it. I mean, that's my mantra. I mean, you don't like X, Y, and Z about Islam, then don't have anything to do with it. But hey, here's something really cool about Islam. So, that's the beauty, maybe, of being a religious naturalist, is that you do get to pick and choose.
Oh, one other thing then, in terms of if you're talking about ritual and you're talking about experiences, I don't even know if you're able to talk about this, but like psychedelic experiences, there must be loads of members that have gone and done that route.
So I'm basically too chicken to have ever done psychedelics. Despite well, I did once. Somebody put LSD in the punch bowl at a party, and I didn't know that, and so I did the whole color thing, and it kind of freaked me out actually, because I didn't know what was going on. But I do smoke marijuana, and I smoke it daily, and have no problem with the many people who have been whose understandings of themselves and of the world have been enhanced with mushrooms or LSD or whatever. That's just, they're out there. It's nature.
Yeah, it's
Try
another
it.
thing that's
Try it. If it works for you, that's cool. If you don't like it or have a bad trip, that's another thing that happens.
Yeah, Carl Sagan wrote, one of your honorary religious naturalists wrote a thing about marijuana and giving him a deeper.
He was a real stoner.
And that's become
Yeah.
a lot easier in the US in recent years.
Oh yeah,
I mean,
yeah, you can get it anywhere, and I grow it in my garden, so
oh, that's so cool.
I even know where it comes from.
Yeah, that's so good, because I actually think even the mass-produced things, it's weird because it's been illegal in many. I think it's probably still illegal. And the law is very complicated, the federal law versus state laws and stuff. But because it's been kind of underground for so long, they did things like using pesticides that were not safe for human use, that were like neurotoxins, because it was amateur, it was criminal and amateur. And so the fact that you can grow outside probably as well in a place like that, is that right?
Oh yeah, no, it's great. And some of my friends, marijuana doesn't work for them. It makes them paranoid. They don't like it. And so none of these, same with alcohol, same with coffee. We use lots of things that alter the way our mind is working. And if they have a benefit, that's fine. If they're abused, then of course it's a tragedy.
Yeah. Yeah. Alcohol probably can be particularly destructive in ways that other things aren't really. But there is still a place for it. I mean, I like to think, that's talking about.
I mean, oxycodone can be just as destructive. So, those guys can kill you.
Instantly devastating, yeah. But one thing I tried to start doing more with alcohol was like beer, which is so familiar, lager and beer, so familiar as to be like nonchalant, not even, it's such an ancient microbial fermentation product. That's a wonderful continuity. People have drank a similar drink going back thousands of years. That's a beautiful thought.
Mm-hmm.
I try and think of that when I'm having a drink.
Native
now.
Americans were smoking peyote for a long time too.
Yeah, and I did a book review of your book, and one of the things I said in it was I felt like, to some extent, we might be kindred spirits. Now, I did that without checking with you whether that was a fair thing to say, but
Yep.
I mean,
all you have to do is, if you join Religious Naturalist Association, then I'll love you for life.
I'm
and it's free, and you get a newsletter every month. That's the only thing that happens.
Yeah, I think so. I'll be honest. You've been so honest in this. I am going to join.
Yay.
I've checked those. Some of those questions were for people watching. Some of them were for me. I mean, I can't I can't dispute anything you're saying in terms of, as a religious naturalist, I think I would be, more aligned with your thinking than others, but that makes sense. We both come from a molecular biology,
Yeah.
microbiology background. And that is where and also the way that pursuit of science adds meaning, not just the science itself, but the for me, kind of exploring for better descriptions of what life is such a meaningful pursuit for me. And that's something that I'm actively working on. And I think that because of the way science is constructed academically, tribally, with different departments that end up talking over each other or thinking their domain is the more important one, which I've done a lot today with microbiology. But I think what we've missed in recent times is a synthesis of that information. And that's why people don't know what's in your book, although you've synthesized it clearly, but people don't know it because there's popular ideas that compete with other ones and argue about the wrong thing. What you've presented is a synthesis.
Let me end with this, that online I learned that the New York Times Magazine had a special issue called Culture, and it was all of the things about culture, and the first 40 pages. I'll send you an email that describes it. The first 40 pages, somebody said, were all about, advertisements for jewelry and Rolls Royces and, things that the New York Times figured their readers might be interested in. But it was about culture, and it was a quiz about how much you knew about culture, and it was this, that, and the other thing about culture, and not one word about the scientific perspective. Not one word about the role. So sure, technology, so I have cell phones, fine, but nothing about our basic understanding of how this all works. And in, a thick magazine. So we're kind of there.
I agree. That's what my experience is. I mean, that's a great example of it. And that's how I feel too, that too often it's just, for me, it's missing completely from
It's too bad. Yeah.
Popular discourse.
People are very interested in themselves.
But that says something too. I feel more kinship with the microbe, the first cells. I'm really drawn to that. I see those as a better exposition of what I am than anything else.
Hundreds of hours looking through the microscope at Chlamydomonas mating and swimming and doing its thing, and I mean, eventually the slide would dry out.
I've not done any of that stuff with the microscope and looking at single-celled organisms.
Your critters are too small.
Yeah, they are. So I need to.
And I've looked at them a lot with the electron microscope, and they're doing their thing. They're just as productive and as they make complete sense to be bacteria. Yeah. But they haven't done the same fancy stuff as the eukaryotes. No question about it.
Yeah, and I mean that's the thing. We're essentially descended from that microbial form of life that gave rise to the complex life that we see around us: animal, plants, humans, consciousness, and that's our story. So that's another religious term there, our story. And what's your preferred term again? Everybody's story.
Everybody's story. Yeah.
Yeah, which is a specific.
It's Loyal Rouge's term, but that's what I use. I mean, some people say it's the universe story, or there are all sorts of other words. Thomas Berry used something, but everybody's story makes sense to me.
So we've talked a lot about that sort of that dichotomy between being human but then respecting other things and not becoming, trying to keep the humility aspect. But at the end of the day, we investigate the universe through our own experiences, even when we do science. So I think to say everybody's story, I still see the need for better or worse, the fact that we do explore these things as humans, as conscious entities, and it is all through that lens.
Everybody's story refers to humans. I mean, the story is about all of creatures and all of time and everything else. But we're the story makers. I mean, even whales and dolphins, certainly, as I say in the book, my cats, whom I adore and share my life with, they're not making up stories. That just isn't what they do. They experience the world immediately. And so everybody's story does really refer in the end to something that I hope all humans can adopt.
And I know we finished this episode.
In addition to something else, you can be a religious naturalist and a Baptist. I know lots of people who do that, and I can't do it. I think they're wizards, but there are people who say, "Yeah, I can be both."
I was meaning to say this to you, was that when you're explaining the biology, you talk about how different organisms have a different number of chromosomes. And then when you took the sort of canonical example to move forward with the explanation, you took the number from the cats. You didn't use the 23 and 46 of humans. You took the cats. And I thought that was
much more fun.
And I thought that was, I captured the kind of generosity of the sentiment of the whole idea. So yeah, thank you so much for joining me today. This was a wonderful conversation.